At 76, Agnes, a Vietnam veteran's widow, was failed by the VA and abused by her manager. When he slapped her across the face in front of a full diner, every customer looked away. The police weren't called. The system abandoned her. But a trucker filmed the assault and sent it to the one man who wouldn't ignore it, the Hells Angels president, a man Agnes had shown kindness to weeks before. The law wasn't coming, but 60 of his brothers were. Before we dive deeper into story, I need to know, where are you watching this from? Help us get this channel to 1,000 subscribers. God bless you for joining the family. She was 76 years old. Agnes wasn't just a waitress. She was an institution, a fixture of the Silver Bell Diner for 40 years. Her hair was white as cotton, and her hands, gnarled and swollen by arthritis, trembled when she poured coffee. She was the moral compass of a town that had long since lost its direction and, in the process, had forgotten her completely. She moved with a slow, painful grace, a ghost in a faded blue uniform, polishing chrome stools that had seen better decades. She was a living memory of a kinder America, stranded in the harsh, unforgiving present. Her story is one of quiet, unassuming dignity, a story that was unfolding in the background noise of a forgotten Rust Belt town. But that quiet was about to collide with a world of roaring steel and unshakable codes. Before we dive deeper into Agnes's story, I want to know where her fight is reaching you. Where are you watching this from? Drop your city, your state, or your country in the comments right now. Let's see how far a story of true honor can travel. Agnes didn't work for passion. She worked for survival. Her late husband, Frank, was a Vietnam veteran. He had come home from the jungle only to be killed decades later by a bureaucratic oversight. A single clerical error, a misplaced file in the vast, indifferent machine of the Department of Veterans Affairs had frozen his pension. Her golden years became a desperate daily struggle. She worked 6 days a week, 8-hour shifts, to pay the mortgage on a tiny, peeling clapboard house and to afford the copay on her essential heart medication. Despite the constant thrum of pain in her joints, Agnes was pure, unfiltered kindness. She didn't need to write orders down. She knew that regular Jim wanted his coffee black with 2 sugars on the side and the sports page folded. She kept a small stash of soft peppermint candies in her apron pocket for the children who rarely came in anymore. She was the only person who asked the long-haul truckers about their families, seeing the exhausted men behind the wheels of their massive rigs, not just the tip they might leave. The Silver Bell Diner was her world, a crumbling relic on a stretch of forgotten highway in Ohio, or maybe western Pennsylvania. It was a monument to the American dream's decay. The neon sign outside, once bright, now flickered, the B in Bell, having burnt out a decade ago. The air inside was a permanent, heavy mixture of stale coffee, decades-old grease, and the unspoken despair of a town that the new interstate had left behind to die. It was a place of last resorts. The light inside was always a dreary, humming, fluorescent gray, barely holding back the permanent, overcast sky of the Midwest. The clientele were the remnants of a boom that had long gone bust. You'd see laid-off steelworkers, still wearing their worn-out jackets, nursing a single cup for hours. You'd see elderly men talking about a past that felt more real than the present. It was not a place where people came to celebrate. It was a place where they came to endure, and Agnes endured right alongside them. In this world, Agnes was utterly alone. The world had moved on. It had become fast and loud and angry. Agnes was slow. Her hands trembled. She represented a quiet kindness that the modern world mistook for weakness. The police? They only drove past on their way to somewhere more important. Social services? A hopeless maze of automated phone lines and indifferent caseworkers who saw her as a case number, not a person. She was a living fossil, and the world was tapping on the glass. And then there was Mr. Henderson, the night manager. Henderson wasn't the owner. He was just a man whose own life had curdled into a bitter, simmering rage. He was a portrait of failed ambition, a small man given a small amount of power, and he wielded his clipboard like a tyrant's scepter. He hated his job, he hated the town, and he hated the peeling vinyl on the booths. But most of all, for reasons he couldn't even articulate, he hated Agnes. He hated her for her quiet grace. He hated her because her endurance was a mirror reflecting his own mediocrity. So he made her life a living hell. He humiliated her in front of the few customers they had. He timed her bathroom breaks with a stopwatch. If her arthritic hands spilled a single drop of coffee, he docked the cost of the refill from her meager, barely legal paycheck. He called her dinosaur and useless, loud enough for the cook to hear. This was the ultimate failure of the system. It had abandoned her at every single level. The VA had failed her husband, stealing her financial security. The local government had failed its elderly, offering no safety net whatsoever. And now, her workplace, her last line of defense, failed to protect her. The other waitresses? They were young, scared, and needed their jobs. They looked away, their silence making them complicit. Agnes was trapped. She had nowhere to turn. It happened 2 weeks before the night everything shattered. A brutal ice storm, the kind that slices across Ohio like a straight razor, had descended on the town. The roads were sheets of glass. The Silver Bell was a tomb, empty, save for Agnes slowly wiping down the Formica counter. The wind howled, rattling the plate glass windows. The front door burst open in a swirl of freezing rain and fury, and a man who looked less like a customer and more like a mountain walked in. This was Rhino. He wasn't just a biker. He was the president of the local Hells Angels chapter, a man whose reputation preceded him. He was enormous, a monolith of wet leather, road grime, and ice. Tattoos crawled up his thick neck and disappeared into a grizzled beard. He looked angry, his face a mask of irritation. His Harley had betrayed him, the engine dying 5 miles back. He stomped the ice from his boots, the sound echoing like gunshots in the empty diner. He didn't take a booth. He muscled a stool at the counter, dripping a puddle of melted ice onto the linoleum. He didn't look at the menu. Coffee, black, he grunted, tossing a few crumpled dollar bills onto the counter. He was waiting for a tow truck, and his patience was clearly non-existent. He hunched over the counter, a thundercloud of pure frustration, radiating an aura that screamed, "Leave me alone." Any other waitress would have hidden in the kitchen, but Agnes was not any other waitress. She looked at him. She didn't see the tattoos, the leather vest bristling with patches, or the monster the town whispered about. She didn't see a criminal. She saw a man who was cold. She saw the deep, bone-chilling cold that had settled into him, the exhaustion in his eyes. She saw a human being, soaked to the skin, stranded in a storm. Her fundamental nature, her deep well of empathy, simply wouldn't allow her to just pour a coffee. She poured the black coffee, but then she turned to the large pot simmering on the stove. She ladled a thick, steaming portion of beef stew into a heavy porcelain bowl. Her hands, knotted with arthritis, trembled as she carried it over. She set it down in front of the giant. "You look like you could use something warm," she said, her voice soft, not asking for permission. "Tonight's stew is on the house. My late husband, Frank, he rode too. He would have hated being this cold." Rhino froze. His hands, which looked like they could crush cinder blocks, were hovering over the coffee cup. He stared at the stew. Then he looked up at Agnes. People didn't give him things. People feared him. They avoided him. They called the cops on him. They didn't offer him free food. He looked at this tiny, frail woman who met his gaze not with fear, but with simple, maternal concern. He was, for the first time in perhaps 20 years, completely and utterly disarmed. His eyes drifted past her to the cluttered wall behind the cash register. Taped there, yellowed with age, was a faded photograph. A young man in a crisp uniform, grinning, sitting proudly on a beautiful old Harley Davidson. Tucked into the corner of the photo's frame was a small bronze Vietnam service pin. Rhino looked at the picture of Frank, then back at Agnes. The pieces clicked into place. This wasn't just random kindness. It was a shared history. You see, Rhino wasn't just a biker. He was a Marine. He had done 2 hard tours in Afghanistan. The patch on his vest wasn't just for show. It was a different kind of uniform. He understood the sacrifice represented by that tiny pin. He understood the cold bureaucracy of the VA. He saw Frank's picture, and in Agnes, he saw the widow that the system had abandoned. She wasn't just a kind old lady. She was family. She was one of his own. He ate the stew. He ate every last drop. The silence in the diner was broken only by the quiet clinking of his spoon against the bowl. It was the warmest, most honest meal he'd had in memory. When the tow truck's flashing yellow lights finally cut through the ice-caked windows, he stood up. He pushed the crumpled dollars back toward her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low, respectful rumble, the anger long gone. He nodded once, and then he was gone, back into the storm. Rhino did not forget that act of grace, that moment of pure, unadulterated humanity in a world that only ever showed him its ugly side, lodged itself deep in his chest. In his world, loyalty is the only currency that matters. Respect is everything. She hadn't judged the leather. She had recognized the man. She had honored his tribe by honoring her husband. She had given him warmth when the world only gave him cold. Agnes had no idea what she had just done. She had had just bought herself an army. The Silver Bell Diner was a relic, a capsule of a time when America was supposed to be about community, but that promise was broken. It sat on a forgotten highway, a symbol of the Rust Belt's decay. The new interstate bypassed it years ago, taking the money and the hope with it. All that remained were the people who couldn't leave, the ones stuck in the past, like Agnes, waiting for a world that would never return. Miles away, the clubhouse was another kind of relic. It wasn't a nostalgic memory. It was a fortress. It operated on a different code, a code of iron and blood. It was a place where honor wasn't a suggestion. It was a law. It was a haven for men who didn't fit in the polite, plastic world. Men who had seen war, who had been judged, and who had formed their own nation with its own rules. Agnes went back to wiping the counter. To her, the encounter was simple. A cold man needed food. She gave it to him. She didn't know his name, his rank, or the power he wielded. She was a woman of simple virtues, living in a world of complex cruelties. She was entirely unaware that her small act of kindness was a seed, and in the hard soil of the brotherhood, it was about to grow into something terrifyingly beautiful. The ice storm passed. Life at the diner returned to its miserable normal. Henderson continued his reign of petty terror. Agnes continued to endure, her hands shaking a little more each day. But the threads of fate had been pulled. The contrast was set. The frail, kind widow, and the mountain of a man who now owed her a debt he was praying he would one day get to repay. The town saw Rhino and his brothers as monsters. When their bikes thundered through Main Street, people locked their doors. They were the other, the scary, tattooed fringe. The polite society of the dying town wanted nothing to do with them. They were the problem. What the town failed to understand, what they would soon learn, is that sometimes the monsters are the only ones left to fight the real monsters. In Rhino's world, there are lines. These lines are not recommendations. They are absolute. You don't disrespect an old woman. You don't abandon your brothers. And you never lay a hand on the widow of a veteran. To do so is not just wrong. It is a declaration of war. It is a sacrilege that demands an immediate and overwhelming answer. Henderson, in his greasy apron and his tiny kingdom, had no idea what kind of ancient law he was about to break. The night it all shattered was a Tuesday, bingo night at the local VFW hall. The Silver Bell was, for the first time in months, unexpectedly swamped. The post-bingo crowd descended all at once, a wave of elderly customers, all impatient, all wanting their pie and coffee now. The small diner was pure chaos. The kitchen bell was ringing off the hook. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and impatient chatter. Agnes was moving as fast as her 76-year-old legs could carry her, a flush on her cheeks. Henderson was not helping. He was in his element. He loved the chaos. It gave him a stage for his tyranny. He stood near the pass-through, his face red, screaming at the cook, screaming at the other waitress. But his primary target, as always, was Agnes. He watched her every move, his eyes narrowed, just waiting for her to fail. He saw her as a broken cog in his machine, and tonight he was determined to break her completely. Agnes was overloaded. Her hands were trembling violently, the stress magnifying her arthritis. She was carrying a heavy circular tray, 3 plates of cherry pie, 2 coffees, and a tall, frosty milkshake. She navigated the narrow aisle between booths. "Move it, dinosaur!" Henderson barked from across the room. "You're holding up the line." The shout startled her. She flinched. It was just enough. Her foot caught the leg of a chair. The tray pitched forward. The pies slid. The coffees sloshed, and the entire milkshake arced gracefully through the air, landing directly down the back of an angry, heavy-set customer. The man leaped to his feet, roaring in surprise and cold. The entire diner fell silent. The chatter stopped. The clinking of silverware ceased. Every eye in the place turned to Agnes, who stood frozen, the empty tray still in her trembling hands, mortified. Henderson saw his opening. He marched across the diner floor, his face a mask of purple rage. He wasn't just angry about the spill. He was furious at the humiliation, at the challenge to his authority. He got right in Agnes's face. "You stupid, worthless old woman," he screamed, spittle flying from his mouth. And then he did the unthinkable. He raised his hand. He slapped her, a sharp, stinging, backhanded slap that cracked through the silence of the restaurant. The force of it snapped her head to the side. Agnes didn't cry out. She didn't make a sound. She just stood there, paralyzed, a bright red mark blooming on her pale, wrinkled cheek. A single silent tear escaped and traced a path down her face. The humiliation was total. It was more painful than the physical blow. She had been assaulted, degraded, and broken. In front of the entire town she had served for 40 years, And what did the crowd do? What did the patrons, the people she'd served pie to for decades, do? Nothing. They looked down at their plates. They shuffled their feet. The man with the milkshake on his back just grumbled and grabbed napkins. They were afraid. Afraid of Henderson. Afraid of making a scene. It didn't matter. They were the system. And in that moment, the system looked away. They chose their cold pie over her dignity. The other waitress, a young woman named Sarah, watched from the kitchen doorway, her hand over her mouth, tears in her eyes. She needed this job. She had 2 kids at home. She couldn't afford to be a hero. Henderson stared her down, a silent threat passing between them. She dropped her gaze. The cook turned back to the grill. The failure was absolute. Agnes was well and truly alone, but not everyone looked away. In a back booth, a trucker sat, a regular. He'd been in the diner that icy night 2 weeks ago. He had seen Agnes give the stew to the giant biker. He had seen her kindness, and now he saw this. His hands weren't shaking. He had his phone in his hand, resting on the table. He had been secretly filming. He caught the whole thing. The shout, the slap, the silence. He didn't call 911. What would they do? Charge Henderson with misdemeanor assault? Give him a $50 fine? The trucker knew real justice when he saw it, and he knew this wasn't it. He knew who Rhino was. He had the number. He paid his check, walked out to his rig, and sent the 10-second video clip. He attached a single simple message. Silver Bell manager. He hit Frank's widow. He hit send. Miles away, at the clubhouse, Rhino was playing pool. His phone buzzed on the rail. He picked it up, expecting a message from a prospect. He watched the video. Once, twice. His face, usually a mask of detached calm, hardened into something cold and terrifying. His knuckles went white as he gripped the phone. He didn't yell. He didn't roar. His voice was worse. It was a low, deadly calm. He set the phone down on the pool table, the video of the slap playing on a loop. His brothers gathered around, watching it. A low growl started in the room. Rhino walked to the center of the clubhouse. He slammed a gavel down on the bar. "Church!" he barked. Now, the music died. The talking stopped. Every man turned to face him. He didn't need to explain. He just pointed to the door. They put hands on Yvette's widow. We ride. Back at the diner, Henderson felt victorious. He had finally broken her. He sneered at Agnes, who was silently cleaning up the mess, her cheeks still burning. "Get back to work," he spat, before retreating to his cramped office in the back to count the night's earnings. He was almost certainly skimming from the tips he'd just confiscated from Agnes. He was king of his little castle, secure in his power. He believed he was untouchable. This is the moment of total despair. This is the vacuum that traditional justice creates. The police weren't coming. The customers were cowards. The staff was powerless. The system, from the VA pension office down to this greasy floor, had failed this good, decent woman. It had allowed a petty tyrant to abuse her, to strike her. The world was officially broken, and when the world breaks, something else has to step in to fix it. The call went out. It wasn't just Rhino's chapter. He made 2 more calls. He called the president of the next. Chapter over. He called the head of the local veterans motorcycle club. This wasn't a club matter anymore. This was a matter of honor. This was about Frank. This was about every veteran the VA had ever screwed over. This was about every good person the world had decided to bully. The response from both was immediate and identical. "We're in." Henderson locked his office door, the cheap lock clicking shut. He felt safe. He was protected by the apathy of the world. He believed in the system that said a manager could abuse an employee. He believed that Agnes was too old, too poor, and too scared to fight back. He believed he had won. He had no idea what kind of system he had just challenged. He hadn't just slapped an old woman. He had slapped an entire brotherhood. Engines were turning over. In garages and bars across 3 counties, men were zipping up heavy leather jackets. They weren't putting on costumes. They were putting on armor. This wasn't a joyride. It was a mobilization. The sound of dozens of Harley-Davidson engines firing up in the cold night air wasn't a sound of rebellion. It was the sound of a judgment bell. Justice was coming, and it was not going to be polite. Agnes finished cleaning the floor. She took a rag and began, on autopilot, to wipe down the counter where Rhino had sat weeks before. She was numb. The diner was quiet again, the bingo crowd having scurried away, eager to forget what they saw. It was just Agnes, Henderson in his office, and the humming of the fluorescent lights. The silence was heavy, oppressive. It was the silence of a world holding its breath, waiting for the thunder. It started as a vibration. Henderson, counting the crumpled bills he'd stolen from the tip jar, felt it in his feet first. He paused. A train? No. The tracks were 5 miles away. The vibration grew, a low, gut-punching thrum. The coffee cups on the shelf behind Agnes began to rattle. The windows chimed. Agnes looked up, her eyes wide with confusion, not fear. The sound sound wasn't passing the diner. It was coming to the diner. The remaining customers, the 2 or 3 regulars left, looked out the front windows. The dark, empty highway was gone. In its place was a river, a pulsing, angry river of chrome and steel and single headlights, stretching back as far as the eye could see. It wasn't 1 or 2 bikes. It was an army. The sound was deafening now. A coordinated rolling thunder that shook the very foundations of the building. It was the sound of 1,000 angry hearts beating as one. They didn't just park, they surrounded the Silver Bell. 60 motorcycles, maybe more. They formed a perfect, menacing perimeter, blocking the entrance, the exit, the entire parking lot. They cut the diner off from the world. One by one, the engines were cut, and the sudden, heavy silence was more terrifying than the noise. The diner was bathed in the red glow of taillights and the blue-white glare of headlights. Trapped in a web of light, Henderson burst from his office, his face pale. He saw the vests. He saw the patches. His mind leaped to the only conclusion a coward could. Robbery. "They're robbing us!" he shrieked. He grabbed Agnes by her already bruised arm. Go out there! Tell them we're closed! Tell them we have no money!" He tried to shove her toward the door, intending to use her as a human shield. He was a bully to the very end, but Agnes didn't have to go anywhere. The front door swung open, the little bell on top tinkling pathetically. Rhino entered. He filled the doorway. He didn't look angry. He looked cold, determined. He was followed by his sergeant-at-arms, and then another man, and another. They filed in, one by one, in perfect, disciplined silence. They were not a mob. They were a military unit. They smelled of cold leather, gasoline, and ozone. They didn't stop. They kept coming. 10, 20, 30. They filled every inch of available space. They stood in the aisles. They filled the space between the jus booths. They lined the counter. They stood shoulder to shoulder, a silent wall of tattooed, bearded giants. The air in the diner became thick, unbreathable. There was no room left. The customers were trapped in their booths, too terrified to move. The sheer physical presence was overwhelming. Rhino's gaze swept the room. He saw the frightened customers. He saw the other waitress, hiding by the kitchen. He saw the angry red mark on Agnes's cheek, and his eyes finally, terribly, settled on Henderson, who was flattened against the wall, his bravado evaporating, leaving only the stench of his fear. Rhino took one slow step toward him. Henderson started to babble. We don't want any trouble. Take what you want." Rhino ignored him completely. He walked right past the terrified manager as if he were a piece of furniture. His focus was singular. He walked directly to Agnes, who stood trembling, believing she was the cause of all this, that these men were here because of her. She thought she was in trouble. Rhino stopped in front of her. He looked down at this tiny woman. The entire room held its breath. The contrast was biblical, the giant and the sparrow. He gently, with his huge, gloved hands, reached out. He didn't touch her face. He touched the strings of her dirty apron. He untied them. He slowly pulled the apron off her, folded it, and placed it on the counter. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low thunder that every person in the diner heard. "You're retired. Effective immediately." Agnes looked at him, her eyes filling with tears of confusion, not humiliation. Then, and only then, did Rhino turn to face the manager. Henderson was sweating, his back sliding down the wall. Rhino didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He leaned in close, invading his personal space. "You made a mistake," Rhino whispered, the sound cutting through the silence. "You put your hands on someone who is under our protection." Henderson started to cry, silent, pathetic, tears. He tried to speak, but only a squeak came out. "This is the moment. This is the pivot. The system failed. The police didn't come. The customers looked away. But the code was honored. This is justice that doesn't wait for a courtroom. This is justice that rides on 2 wheels. If you believe that the powerful, even a petty tyrant in a small diner, shouldn't be allowed to prey on the vulnerable, I want you to smash that like button. Your engagement proves that people still care. More about real justice than bureaucracy. Rhino stepped back. "Boys," he said, "I'm thirsty." A biker at the front spoke up. "I'll have a glass of water, please, ma'am." He nodded to the other waitress, Sarah, who was frozen. Then another biker. "Water, please." And another. "Water." 60 men, one by one, politely ordered a glass of water. Sarah, shaking, started filling glasses. Henderson, realizing he wasn't going to be beaten, tried to regain control. That's fine, but then you have to leave." Rhino just smiled. It was not a nice smile. "Oh, we're not leaving. We're patrons." After the water, they ordered coffee. All 60 of them, one at a time. They drank it slowly. Then they all needed to use the single-stall restroom, forming a line that snaked through the entire diner. They were polite. They said, "Please," and thank you, but they were occupying the diner. No new customers could get in. Henderson couldn't close. He was their hostage. And then came the checks. I need a receipt, the first biker said, pulling out a massive bag. He dumped a pile of coins onto the counter. For my water, he paid the dollar in pennies, all pennies. The next man did the same, and the next. 60 men, 60 checks, 60 piles of pennies, demanding receipts for each. It was a bureaucratic nightmare. A weaponization of mundane details. Henderson was forced to count, his hands shaking. While Henderson counted, other bikers, the veterans, began to inspect the diner. "Hey, Rhino," one called out, pointing his flashlight app into a dark corner. "That looks like rodent droppings. That's a severe violation of the county health code." Another opened a fridge. "This milk is warm. Temperature's not right. Someone could get sick." They were loud, they were specific, and the trucker who sent the video, he was already on the phone with the county health inspector, giving a very, very detailed anonymous tip. Henderson's world was collapsing. He wasn't just being intimidated, he was being systematically dismantled. His authority was gone. His diner was contaminated. His finances were a pile of pennies. The bikers didn't lay another finger on him. They didn't have to. They were killing him with rules, with his own game. The terror in his eyes wasn't of a beating. It was the terror of total, complete, and utter ruin. Outside, the town had noticed. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains. A lone police car drove up, saw the wall of motorcycles, saw the patches, saw the sheer number of men, and just kept driving. The official system wanted no part of this. They were terrified. The community that had ignored Agnes's plight was now face to face with the consequences of their apathy. They had allowed a vacuum to form, and now something much scarier had filled it. The bikers formed a natural wall. They weren't just there to punish Henderson. They were there to protect Agnes. They had become a physical barrier between her and the world that had hurt her. She sat on a stool, dazed, as one of the bikers, a man with a tattoo covering his entire face, gently asked her if she'd like a glass of water. They had transformed from a perceived threat into the ultimate shield. Rhino let Henderson stew in his own panic for an hour, counting pennies, listening to the violations. Finally, he walked back to the counter. He took a thick envelope from his jacket. He didn't give it to Henderson. He gave it to Agnes. "This is from Frank's brothers," he said. "This pays off your mortgage. You're done." Inside was cash, tens of thousands of dollars, collected from bikers and vets in 3 counties. Rhino turned back to Henderson one last time. The manager was just a puddle of a man. "You're finished," Rhino said, not as a threat, but as a statement of fact. "The health department will be here by morning. The IRS might be interested in your tip skimming, and you will never ever work in this town again. We'll know." He didn't need to explain how. He just would. The promise was absolute. The bikers didn't leave all at once. They filed out just as they had come in, with quiet, intimidating discipline. Rhino was the last to leave. He paused at the door and looked back at Agnes. She was sitting on the stool, clutching the envelope, her folded apron on the counter beside her. He nodded once more. "God bless, ma'am." Then he was gone. The engines roared to life, a final, deafening salute. And then, as quickly as they came, the river of chrome and steel flowed back onto the highway and disappeared into the night. Silence descended on the Silver Bell, but it was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of a tomb. Henderson was left alone, surrounded by 60 glasses, 60 small checks, and piles of pennies. He was ruined. The other customers scurried out. Finally, Sarah, the other waitress, just took off her own apron and dropped it on the floor. She walked out without a word. The diner was dead, as promised. The health inspector arrived at 8 a.m. The Silver Bell was shut down for 27 separate violations. It never reopened. Henderson was disgraced. He was exposed as a thief and an abuser. He tried to find work at another restaurant in the next town over, but the story had traveled. The Brotherhood has long arms. Nobody would hire him. He was last seen working a gas station pump 60 miles away, a broken man. The justice delivered wasn't just a single night of terror. It was the complete and total dismantling of his life, a precise reflection of the abuse he'd inflicted on Agnes. And Agnes, she was not left alone. 2 bikers escorted her home that night, watching her house until dawn to ensure her safety. The next day, a Saturday, the army returned. But they didn't come in leather. They came in jeans, with tool belts and lumber. They were contractors, electricians, plumbers. They spent the entire weekend fixing her house. They replaced her leaky roof. They fixed her broken furnace. They painted her walls. They didn't just fix the house, they filled it. A pickup truck backed up to her door, and the bikers formed a chain, passing boxes and bags into her kitchen. They filled her pantry. They stocked her freezer, meat, vegetables, canned goods, coffee. Enough food to last a year. They were repaying the debt of that one bowl of stew 1,000 times over. They were showing her what the word family truly meant. On Sunday evening, as they finished, Rhino presented her with a gift. It was a small black leather vest, child-sized almost, but on the back was the club's full patch. "Your family now, Agnes," he told her. "You are protected. No one will ever lay a hand on you again." She was no longer a forgotten widow. She was a member of the Brotherhood, an honorary old lady. She had a new set of sons. The town watched all of this. The neighbors who had hidden behind their curtains saw these monsters rebuilding a widow's home. They saw them carrying groceries, not weapons. The community was forced to look in the mirror. They had failed one of their own. And the people they had feared, the people they had judged, were the only ones who showed up. The prejudice that had defined their town was shattered. They had judged the wrong people. The power dynamic of the entire town shifted. The bikers weren't feared in the same way. They were respected. They had proven that their code, while rough, was more just than the town's apathy. They became the unofficial guardians of the forgotten. They had drawn a line in the sand, and the entire community now knew, you don't mess with the vulnerable, because the monsters are watching. This is the essence of cathartic justice. It wasn't just about punishment, it was about restoration. Henderson was ruined, yes, but more importantly, Agnes was saved. Her finances were restored, her home was restored, and most importantly, her dignity was restored. The humiliation of the slap was washed away by an overwhelming flood of loyalty and protection. The scales were not just balanced, they were tipped entirely in her favor. Think of that image, a 76-year-old woman, her white hair shining, sitting on her newly repaired porch, drinking coffee. A massive tattooed biker sits beside her, just talking. They are family. This is the new normal. The kindness she put out into the world, that one bowl of stew, came back to her not as a gentle ripple, but as a tidal wave. It proved that no act of goodness, no matter how small, is ever wasted. The world will tell you to mind your own business. The world will tell you that the system will handle it. But Agnes's story teaches us something different. It teaches us that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's seeing a cold man and offering him stew. And it teaches us that justice isn't always found in a courtroom. Sometimes it's found in a brotherhood that refuses to let the good be consumed by the cruel. Heroes exist. They don't always wear capes or badges. Sometimes they ride Harleys. Sometimes they're covered in tattoos. Sometimes the scariest looking people are the only angels we have. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that there is still profound good in this world, and that loyalty is the most powerful weapon of all. And let me know in the comments, what did that final act of justice mean to you?